Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture in this benighted age, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And visit patreon.com/VMSPod or paypal.me/VMSPod to make a one-time or recurring donation and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. Well, I've got a ton of episodes lined up. I'm actually way ahead, so we're probably going to do double episode weeks going forward. And I was sort of hemming and hawing about who to run in this week's first slot. But last week's episode was with Simon Doonan, and I had this great conversation ready with Simon Critchley, and I thought, if I let a Simon and Simon opportunity pass me by, I won't be living up to my 80s TV-watching youth. So, in honor of Jameson Parker and Gerald McRaney, this episode features Simon Critchley, author of the fantastic new book, Tragedy, the Greeks, and Us, published by Pantheon. The book explores what the tragedies, the Greek tragic plays, may have meant to the ancient Athenians and how they resonate for us, but it also really gets into the nature of the plays and the deep issues about human life that they ask. And most importantly, how and why Plato and Aristotle each tried to neuter or excise the tragedies from their versions of the good life. So the book, in the process of exploring the tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, it also becomes a critique of philosophy from the founders onward. And to me, that's just immensely enjoyable reading. I mean, from page one, this book made me feel like I was back at St. John's College, which those of you longtime listeners know I still consider the most important period of my life in terms of learning, making conversation, playing basketball, catting around, everything that goes toward my idea of the good life. So that would have been good enough. But Critchley, what he does, he explores not just the tension between the tragedies and the early philosophers, but like the nature of storytelling and sophistry and how we see the world. He brings up a line from Gorgias, the sophist, that tragedy creates a deception in which the deceiver is more honest than the non-deceiver, and the deceived is wiser than the non-deceived. And it kind of opened my eyes in terms of how to explore this stuff and how to live with a universe that's a lot messier and less ordered than the structures that Plato builds in his Republic and the like, and that so much of philosophy tries to build in terms of ordered systems. Anyway, Tragedy, the Greeks, and Us is a marvel and a marvelous book. And I was thrilled when Simon said he was up for recording with me about it. See, I've enjoyed his writing on a variety of topics over the years, and I figured we could jump into some of his non-classical themes like sports and David Bowie. You guys know I appreciate people who can kind of leap from subject to subject while applying the same consideration and rigor, like not treating things lightly just because they're not Plato and Aristotle. Sort of like when Jerome Charan and I debated the value of Rajon Rondo in today's NBA. I still think I won that argument. Anyway, as caveats go, air conditioning was on, and because of the weird acoustics of the apartment, filtering the noise out left some other artifacts and a kind of weird ringing tone at various times. Sorry, I'm just not good enough as an engineer to figure out how to kind of tweak that stuff out of it. Now, here's Simon's bio from the book. There is, well, What's on his website, if you go to the About page, is a massively long interview about him, so I'm just going to go with the flap copy from the book. Simon Critchley is Hans Jonas Professor of Philosophy at the New School for Social Research. His many books include Very Little, Almost Nothing, The Book of Dead Philosophers, The Faith of the Faithless, and Memory Theater. He is the series moderator of The Stone, a philosophy column in the New York Times, to which he's a frequent contributor. His newest book is Tragedy, the Greeks, and Us. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Simon Critchley, already in progress with a discussion of a class he's teaching this term.
And we're doing this class called Human Observation. Human Observation. Yeah. And we're looking at... we're going to try and get students to...
Learn to see?
To see. To see.
Yeah,
to see. And we're giving them some phenomenology for several weeks, a bit of William James, late James, radical empiricism, and then we're going to go through a series of sort of non-fiction texts, people like J.A. Baker, The Peregrine.
Oh, God. I've been pushing that book off on everybody I know for the last year and a half, or 2 years since I discovered it.
We're going to use that as, that's kind of what we're trying to get students to do.
Yeah. I had a late cancellation last week, so I had no episode going into last week's week. So I did the Gil Roth Ask Me Anything, and one guest, I had past guests and my Patreon supporters just send in questions, and I spent 2 hours, single take, which you'll learn I can actually talk for 2 straight hours.
That's impressive.
And one of them said to me, when we met 2 years ago at a festival, you told me I had to read The Peregrine. I bought it, but I haven't read it yet. When's the best time of year? And I just launched into my whole shtick about The Peregrine and how it changed how and I live in the woods, basically. I'm just on the edge of this stuff. And it just changed everything in terms of how I perceive the world around me, at least the natural world around me. There was a science fiction trilogy that I read just around the same time, a recent one by Jeff Vandermeer called Area X. And he's a environmental science fiction guy, and it dovetailed nicely, but the writing is nowhere near as beautiful as what Baker does in The Peregrine. In fact, I'd wanted to interview his biographer, but the only time I can get to the UK is going to be 1 week after the hard deadline for Brexit. And I'm not setting foot.
It's kind of, I think these are interesting times, actually.
But if you don't have an English passport and you're trying to leave the country and you discover that everyone in the EU also has to get on a passport, I just don't want to discover there's a 6-hour delay at the airport for anything.
Oh, yeah. It's going to be like the Millennium Bug. I'm feeling quite relaxed about Brexit, actually.
Yep.
I think I don't live there, so...
Right.
It's almost enjoyable watching the...
At a distance.
...disaster unfold. And these debates are very, very old debates. In a sense, it's a new development and everything, but the core issue goes back to the 60s, really.
Yeah.
And so...
but we should talk about the book first before we get into Brexit.
Let's get going.
I was going to ask about the origins of it, but in a sense, I wonder how much it's tied into the last word of the title, the us of Tragedy, the Greeks, and Us. Can you talk about the us and where the book comes from in that context?
The us. Well, we didn't know what to call the book, and I used to have a lot of confidence in titles for books, and experience has led me to have less confidence in my title. So the original title was going to be Tragedy's Philosophy, which seems kind of neat, but doesn't really say anything. And then we struggled with titles for ages, and then my editor, Dan Frank, I think it was Dan, came up with the idea of Tragedy, the Greeks and Us as a subtitle. And then we needed a title. And so we really, the book was done pretty much. It was done. We didn't have a title, so he had this great idea. We were going to call it Having Been Born. Having Been Born. Tragedy, the Greeks and Us. And then you had this kind of Beckettian kind of Anne Carson feel to that title, and the sin of having been born. That's really what tragedy is about. I like that. And then I said it to a couple of people, and I couldn't actually say the words "having been born." And then whoever I said, what's the book called? The book's called "Having Been Born." What does that mean? Oh, it's called Tragedy of the Greeks and Us. Then I thought,
you're overthinking it.
Yeah, the UK editor said that's not going to work.
They'll put it in maternity self-help.
Call it Tragedy of the Greeks and Us. Okay. So then we went to Tragedy of the Greeks and Us, and that's what it became. And so I don't feel responsible for the title at all, is what I'm saying. I mean, it kind of, I think of it as my book on tragedy, and my kind of quiet, or maybe not so quiet, but kind of critique of the profession that I've been associated with my career, namely philosophy. So that's really... And the others is, sure. Well, the other bit is we have to reinvent... Every generation has to reinvent the classics. We have to... Antiquity is a strange thing in the sense in which what I like about antiquity is the gaps, the fact that there's so much that we don't know. Mm-hmm. So by necessity, we see what we project onto it. So antiquity is a strange kind of game of mirrors where, there was ancient Greece, this did happen. And, the weird thing about archaeology is it's often ended up proving a lot of things that were considered to be only mythic, like the existence of Troy in the 19th century. And so we see ourselves in this mirror of antiquity. So in a sense, what we're seeing is, by definition, always us. But it's us under a new aspect. It's like Wallace Stevens' man with the blue guitar, who sees things as they are, but as they are for the man on the blue guitar. Yeah. And they're changed upon that blue guitar. So so the us is a kind of a double us. It's both, this is, I guess I'm claiming some kind of contemporary relevance for things, but it's also that we cannot but look at antiquity through the fantasies and projections that we project back onto it through the kind of rear view mirror of history.
I think you dismiss that sense of exoticness in some respects about the Greeks, that we don't want to say there's no difference between antiquity and modernity, but but that you shade things a lot more than
I mean, and that's kind of I guess where that book project begins. I mean, in the mists of time was the second philosophy class I did.
Did studied or did teach?
I studied.
Okay.
Was on the began with the pre-Socratics and then ended up in Plato's dialogues, and a book that we were given to read as kind of, scripture at that point was a book called The Discovery of the Mind by Bruno Schnell. And Bruno Schnell's claim is that, in a sense, the Greeks were very exotic creatures who didn't really have any conception of themselves as fully integrated human beings. They were kind of body parts. The mind is something that emerges over a course of several centuries, and then we get the invention of rationality and the invention of all these things. And that's a nice story. It's a very convenient story that, in a sense, the Greeks, there is a Greek, miracle, as people used to say, a shift from myth to reason, and then a shift from myth, from epic poetry, Homer, through to tragic poetry, then through to philosophy, to rationality. And we have this nice developmental story, right? And then here we are some millennia later, and we've experienced all this progress. And that's a great comfort. And then you look at these plays from 3 millennia ago, and you discover that actually, were they really so different? Was there experience of, was Greek drama, is it that different from, say, Shakespearean drama, or what Ibsen was up to? Really? I mean, how do you really show that? And obviously it was written a long time ago and performed a long time ago, but the strange thing about tragedy is the kind of the kind of anachronism of it, in a sense that it unlike, I think, many other literary forms, it is weirdly contemporary, right? So if you put a play of Euripides, let's say you put Euripides' Hippolytus next to Seneca's Phaedra, next to Racine's Phaedra, next to Sarah Kane's Phaedra's Love, and you line them all up, you'd be able to tell differences between those 4 treatments of the same story, but you wouldn't be able to say, well, here's a clear historical development. It's just not like that. So, and that indicates that there are certain, dare one say, timeless or enduring themes in these plays which call for our attention.
And when did the book originate for you? How long did it take?
Well, the book. So when I got my first job at the University of Essex, I began to teach a class on philosophy and literature, and it's something I did for years. And then I'd teach a couple of plays, but I would very much teach a little bit of Plato, a little bit of Aristotle, and then modern, largely German theories of the tragic. Hegel, Schelling, Nietzsche, Heidegger. And I had this, what I thought was quite a clear view of the nature of the tragic and its importance, and the drama, in a sense, wasn't really terribly important in that whole picture. And I taught that intermittently over the years, and then much later, around, I guess, 2010, 11, I began to think about it in different ways. Think about this whole question of tragedy in very different ways. And I was doing a whole bunch of other work, and I was trying to write a book on Shakespeare and different things like that, and then kind of had the whole thing flipped over, and I began to see tragedy as a distinctive way of viewing the human condition and life in the world, that was fundamentally missed by philosophy from Plato onwards.
Or deliberately excluded.
Excluded, yeah. Excluded in Plato, domesticated by Aristotle, and then progressively kind of sanitized and cleansed over the centuries into kind of neat theories of the tragic that you can get in some of the early Nietzsche, Apollo, Dionysus, or whatever. And I became increasingly engaged by what was actually going on in the dramas and the plays. And so then the project became about the plays. And what do these plays tell us that the philosophy is not telling us, and which we need to attend to? And then so I spent a summer in about maybe 2011, because like many people, I hadn't read enough. I'd read, I knew the Oresteia fairly well. I knew the Theban plays of Sophocles fairly well, and then 1 or 2 plays by Euripides. But I then began to read everything, and then spent a summer reading all of Euripides' plays.
Mm-hmm.
Not that there's that many, but I read them kind of sequentially, and then began to read them as a kind of, almost like a kind of a code. There was something really going on here that was really interesting, and I had to, and this would be my way of questioning and upending what was going on in particularly Plato and Aristotle, and then, by implication, everything else that followed since. So, the kind of the upshot of that was that the question of theatre, which had really, didn't really interest me, didn't really get my attention when I was first thinking about these things, then became the kind of the most important issue. What is it? What's going on in the experience of theatre? What kind of thing is that experience? What can we say about it? And then the book kind of took shape over, I guess, from about 2012. I taught a class with Judith Butler, and that was very important because I learned a lot from Judith, and she, I plagiarized a good amount of her work in the finished product, and then I was going to write a book on tragedy. I was under contract for that, and then things changed course, and I had this neat idea with Jameson Webster of writing a book on Hamlet that would look at Shakespeare's Hamlet and then interpretations of Shakespeare's Hamlet. And that then became, we did that book, and then after some years I went back to the tragedy material and kept, and it got very, it was hard to finish, because I knew I wanted to write. I had basically of the book, the published book, what's now the first 2 chapters, which are really on tragedy, were more or less in shape by about 2014. I had this material on sophistry that I was developing, which I was very attached to. I knew I wanted to write on Plato and Aristotle. I'd never really written on either of them at real length. And then from about 2016 to, I guess, about a year ago, I wrote the Plato chapter, the Aristotle chapter. And the Aristotle chapter in particular was really hard to figure out, but
as Aristotle himself can be.
Yeah, because he can lull you into a sense of security. You just get, Aristotle is, sort of master of the obvious, and he makes these distinctions, and you just kind of nod your head and think, okay, fair enough, we'll go with that.
It keeps providing a framework that becomes a cage.
Yeah, it becomes a cage, and also but how do you write about the poetics? I mean, here's a really tricky question: the sense in which the way we see arts in general, poetry, and then drama, tragedy, is really through these 10,000 words that we find in Aristotle's Poetics. And how can one write about that? And so what I ended up doing was and this I'm pleased with in the book, is in part the Aristotle chapter, which is about 100 pages long, is commentary on Aristotle, which is, I like the idea of writing commentary on Aristotle. It just makes me feel like, a 10th century philosopher in Baghdad or something like that, or it's and then to use every moment in Aristotle when a question opens up, and then to go to the plays, and in particular the plays of Euripides, and just try and open Aristotle up from inside and try and dismantle it.
Yeah, to me, when I was reading the Poetics back in graduate school in St. John's 25 years ago, it was Euripides who kind of blew up every Aristotelian conception of tragedy. I think of the Alcestis, or Alcestis, I never know how to pronounce it, where ultimately he's an incredibly flawed human being, and the only thing that saves everything is that he's a really good host. And Heracles just, oh, you're such a great host, let me go arm wrestle death and get your wife back. It's a romance, not a tragedy. And it's one of those things where the classifications are all there, a la Aristotle. And the play itself counters every expectation of the work that's got a template.
Right. What Aristotle gives us, in which we accept, is the idea of genre, the idea that there are these genres: tragedy, comedy, epic, philosophy, history, and these genres are neatly defined, and then we can insert these plays into them. And then you take something like Euripides, and it just doesn't fit,
right?
Because it's not tragedy in the way in which Aristotle describes it. It's not really comedy. So then, what do we call them? If they're Shakespeare plays, we call them problem plays, which means we don't know how to fit them into any box. And so Euripides is a kind of is one of the heroes of the book, and the strangeness and the strangeness of Euripides, and the modern character of Euripides is so interesting. And
do you remember a eureka moment for yourself with this? Before it sounds like in that 2011 stretch, like you'd said, there was a realization that the tragedies might be saying more to us, or might have more to say to us than we thought. Do you recall an instance of, wait a second, or is it something that emerged over...
Emerged, maybe it was the idea of moral ambiguity, that...
You're watching too many of those middle-aged anti-hero TV shows on I'm just kidding.
Right, yeah, exactly, yeah. I mean, it's... I mean, the idea that... I guess the idea that I'm opposed to is that drama is like Guinness. It's good for you, right? I think that what's going on in these plays is something much more complex and ambiguous. So the idea that, I remember writing this down at a certain point, that tragedy is moral ambiguity, and that moral ambiguity is often very carefully structured around one word. So, for example, in the most famously in Antigone, the word is law, nomos. And what does that mean? Well, Creon says it means this, and Antigone says it means that. And the drama, the play, is the working out, is the conflict between those two conceptions of law, and what do we take from that? A view of Antigone, a convenient view, is that Antigone is kind of the heroine of the play, and Creon is the bad guy. That's far from clear to me. Antigone clings to her conception of what law means, divine law, which means you get to bury your family members, and the family get to bury its dead. And then Creon's idea of law, which is that if someone is an enemy of the city, then they don't deserve to be buried. And both those conceptions of law are shown in this conflict. And we as spectators observe that ambiguity, and we're not told what to do. So I guess the real maybe this was the eureka moment, or a eureka moment. The idea of moral ambiguity, then the idea that in philosophy, or a standard view of philosophy, is that philosophy asks questions. It asks questions that have a universal form. What is justice? And the answer to those questions is going to be one thing. Justice is, a virtue that is orientated towards the good, as Socrates seems to be telling us in the Republic. Whereas in the plays, the opposite seems to happen. We see people who've often got an attachment to what is the case. Law means this, says Antigone. No, law means that, says Creon. And we see those rival conceptions of law engaged in a fight where people die. A lot of people die. And the end of that process is often the articulation of a question. And the question is often in the plays. And I began to track this in the plays. What shall I do? What shall I do? And that was going to be one title for the book very early on. What shall I do? But it just seemed too vague. But that's really, so rather than the idea of philosophy as raising a question, and which through a process of dialogue we then come to some answer to that question, drama goes in a different way. We go through this conflictual, I think of as a dialectical experience where things are being negated, human beings are being negated, being killed, the gods are interfering, all sorts of things are happening. At the end of that, the chorus usually will articulate the question, what shall I do? What do I believe? What is going on? And it's that sense of ambiguity and disorientation that I want to put centre stage, as it were, in this book.
And in the process, like you said, critique both Plato/Socrates and Aristotle.
Yeah.
And I mean,
and does, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, us in the sense in which, that I think that Plato and Aristotle, in a sense, it's fine. Plato is...
you tie Plato into monotheism and
yeah.
Yeah, but go on.
So that Plato is a... Plato's dialogues are an incredibly complex literary artifice which will never exhaust or really know what this is for. Aristotle, we have lecture notes. We have notes probably written by students. We have these texts. We lost all of his dialogues. He wrote a lot of dialogues as well. He wrote a lot of other things as well. But we have this idea of, Aristotle as this expert in monologue. And the idea that there's a settled moral view on things. And, and this is the invention of, a kind of moral monotheism, monototheism, as Nietzsche would say, that we end up, and here we are at the end of, this book was written, finished in the last few years, when I guess what I find most peculiar about where we've got to in our thinking is the our commitment to new and pernicious forms of moralism and moral certainty, and people cling to their moral certainties, and that's so. What I guess the one thing that drama can do is that it can engage, it can draw people into an experience where their moral certainties, their prejudices, their presumptions can be suspended for the period of watching that drama unfold, and they can then enter into a different kind of experience of disorientation. And I think this is why the book is it's a very negative book in a way. It's really it's a kind of long labour of negation. I'm saying no to philosophy as it's usually understood, and saying no to the idea that we can easily render intelligible things, come to say views on that which is the case, what philosophers call ontology, the nature of being, and on the basis of that understanding of what is the case, we can then derive certain moral assumptions, certain moral views. Whatever's going on in tragedy kind of upends that whole process. We don't know what is the case, and we don't know what to do. So to that extent, it's a kind of a negative enterprise, without the kind of
moral at the end.
Yeah, and this is not the way you're meant to write books on antiquity. You're meant to draw something out of antiquity that is a clear moral lesson for our times, whether it's Stoicism or Aristotle or whatever, and we show the relevance of these things to and what we can learn from these philosophers in order to instruct us in how to live in the present. And I guess what I'm saying is no. We're at the very least, we're cleverer than that, right? And things are muddier and more interesting than that. And that's what's going on in drama.
At what point in your career was critiquing Plato and Aristotle clear for you? At what point did you evolve into that over time, or was it part of the philosophic education in the 70s, 80s?
No, not really. Because I steered. I mean, because the work I did early on was very much on 20th century philosophy, German and French, and then I was very much concerned with contemporary issues and the history of philosophy, very much from Kant and after Kant to the present. And so I wasn't really a specialist in antiquity or had much of. I had an interest, but I didn't really develop it, and so it came late. And then I had the.
Was it a sense of a nagging root or something that trying to figure out what was dissatisfying about philosophy? In that respect.
Yeah. I mean, it was I guess it's 30 years of sitting in seminars and listening to people give papers where everyone seems to know what they think. They say it, and then people make objections to it, and we go through this kind of ritual dance of arguing a thesis, defending it, and then subjecting it to criticism. Nothing wrong with that implicitly, but there is a kind of preposterousness to the whole episode. So the Platonism of that rankled, and I guess I'm not a metaphysician. I mean, I don't think that we can. I don't think that we have knowledge of the ultimate nature of reality through the use of reason or through the use of anything else. So to that extent, I've never been a kind of foundationalist. And my interests have always been more kind of, how would I describe that? More kind of, for example, I wrote a book. I was thinking about this in relationship to your conversation with Bloom, that who I've I've never met him, but I've I've learnt a lot from him, but have an antagonistic relationship to much of what he says. But I wrote a book on Wallace Stevens.
That's a sure way to rankle Bloom.
Yeah, it came out in 2005, and that book is an attempt to show that there's a form of meditation, philosophical meditation, in Stevens, which is able to enact poetically in the particular way in which he does it, particularly in the poems of the middle and the late period, poems like Ordinary Evening in New Haven, Idea of Order at Key West, and then some of the late poems from The Rock. And he's able to give voice to the relationship between thought or ideas and the world in a way that is poetic and which cannot be captured philosophically. Mm-hmm. That if that's articulated philosophically, you kind of miss the point. And indeed, when Stevens himself wrote philosophy, he wrote a paper called A Collect of Philosophy. His thinking doesn't really work. There's something about, and even in his essays in The Necessary Angel, which are wonderful, but they're uneven. And he was able to think in the form of verse in a certain way. So I've always been attracted to the idea of thought being articulated in propositional, non-strictly philosophical forms, whether that's poetry or music, or indeed it could be, I did a book on soccer where I try and show that's going on in soccer too. And so that idea of the limitations of philosophy is something which has been a consistent preoccupation of mine, and drama is kind of what that leads to, where that is articulated in its highest and most perplexing form.
It was something I found fascinating in the book, particularly in the Plato section, because it's a question since I started reading Plato almost 30 years ago, writing it as a dialogue, and what it means that these things are done as dialogue. And as we see in the Republic, he's critiquing the tragedians. They have to be banished from the city, and yet everything he's writing is dramatic in a sense.
Yeah.
At my senior year of college, I apparently melted my professor's brain by treating the Meno as though it was an actual drama, not simply text back and forth. And he, for some reason, never considered the fact that it was a dialogue to be something that was meant to be read dramatically, or to have dramatic tension within it.
No, we read through
as though it's simply the text.
Yeah, text to what we think of as Plato's arguments or Plato's views, and it's wrong. Yeah. It's demeaning to Plato. What Plato does, we don't know why he did it. We don't know what it meant, but I
was very happy, by the way, you didn't fall into some sort of Straussian craziness with the book and have the secret subtext and
right. No, I don't believe that.
Very good.
I mean, there might have been an esoteric teaching in who knows, but we don't know that. And but the Platonic dialogues are dramatic. They are a form of imitation, of mimesis, at the same time as being a critique of imitation in the Republic and elsewhere. And like tragedy, so in one of the things that I try and show in the book is that tragedy has an anachronistic structure. It's both taking place in the present, using the resources of the present, the emergence of the discourse of law, in particular in the plays, and techniques like sophistical argument. But that's over against the anachronism of the Bronze Age, of the Trojan War, the Mycenaean period, the time of the gods. So there's this kind of disjunction that's operative in tragedy between what was the present for the 5th century Attic Greeks and this deep past, and these two times are projected simultaneously in the plays. Similarly, in Plato, everything is hinged around the death of Socrates, who becomes kind of the tragic hero to some extent. Namely, the dialogues, not all the dialogues, but the vast majority of the dialogues feature Socrates at different times of his life, involved with different interlocutors in different contexts, and they're written by Plato 50, 70 years later. So he's exploiting dramatically the anachronism of writing after the death of Socrates stories about Socrates in his life. And so what you constantly get references to in the Republic and elsewhere is the fact that what's at stake in these discussions is could cost you your life, and it did cost. And the idea of Socrates constantly being on trial in the dialogue. So the Platonic dialogues are this complex, dramatic series of conceits which are beautiful and splendid and multifarious and incredibly powerful and weird as well. So the Platonic dialogues are a kind of rival discourse to tragedy. And in the Republic, when Socrates and his interlocutors are imagining a city a just city that would be a city that only exists in speech, but a just city, then that just city has to be premised upon, which is itself argued in the drama of dialogue, is premised upon the exclusion of tragedy and the tragic poets. And so what I try and do in the Plato chapter, which I'm quite proud of that chapter, because it's years and years of work that I kind of tried to make the work kind of disappear, so it kind of, you can drift through it kind of easily. But to look at books 2, 3, and 10 of Plato's Republic, and to try and show how philosophy is constituted on the basis of the exclusion of imitative drama, of tragedy, and how that is done for the reason of in order for philosophy to regulate emotion or regulate affect, and in particular the affect or emotion that Socrates is most disturbed by.
Yeah, I was saying concerned with, but yeah, disturbed is...
Disturbed is grief. Yeah. Mourning, grief, lamentation. Whatever these 31 tragedies that we have, what many of them are about is about grief and the effects of grief on the city and what we do with grief. And we see people in these plays grieving and grieving hard. And what does that mean? One of the things I'm trying to do in the book is to work out what that means. Whatever philosophy means, it has to minimize that, to get that out of the city, because that is a kind of poisonous cancer for Socrates. And what's involved? What is involved in that exclusion of tragedy, that exclusion of grief, of mourning? What's involved in that for the way we think about thinking and think about ourselves and all the rest? And the other aspect of this, which is really interesting, and again, we can't come to a settled view, but it raises so many compelling questions, is the question of gender. That
and grieving is feminine.
Yes, so the grieving is grieving. If you grieve, to grieve, to become fattened on grief, is to become effeminized as a human being, and this is a great danger for Socrates, and what we have in the transition from the dramas of the 5th century, the tragedies of the 5th century, through to the philosophical dialogues, is in the Platonic dialogues, the 27 of them, there are 2 female characters. There is Diotima, the goddess from whom Socrates learns about love, and his wife Xanthippus, who appears in the Phaedo and who's dismissed for being too emotional. And Socrates gets rid of her early on so he can be with his boys and die the philosopher's death. So whatever happens in philosophy is what takes place when the boys go inside for a chat. And tragedy, which is written by men, performed by men, nonetheless, at its core, is full of grieving women and
angry women.
Angry women, and the anger is an anger that flows from grief.
I wondered whether the play should be Clytemnestra instead of Agamemnon.
Right. Yeah.
He has almost no dialogue in it whatsoever, but
yeah. Well, yeah, it's you also say the opposite about Antigone, that Antigone should really be called Creon,
sure.
but you've got you have tragedies full of women in trouble, women who are often the situation of the consequences of war, the Trojan War. So a play like The Trojan Women, which is a play that I talk about a couple of times in the book. The play begins with these women gathered on the plain outside Troy. The men have been killed. Most of the children the boys have been killed, and the boy is killed Astiniax is killed in the play, and the women are gathered waiting to be taken off as booty by the Greek generals, by the Argive leaders, and they and we hear them grieve and weep and wail and argue. And what does that mean? What is that about? We don't know, but it's something incredibly powerful and suggestive, and that whole experience is kind of closed down by the invention that we call philosophy. That just gets pushed to one side. Mm-hmm. So there's also a very interesting gender dimension to all of this, which what does that mean? We don't know what it means. I mean, so the best people that have worked on this, people like Nicole Laureau, is the depiction of women in tragedy, is this some kind of questioning of the patriarchy of the Greek city-state, some undermining of the social norms of the time? Or is it just men dressing up as women and having a good time?
So I'm so glad this episode is going to air immediately after the Simon Doonan one about the history of drag that we recorded a week or so ago. So it's going to be a perfect dovetail with these.
Well, tragedy is drag. Yeah. Everything's in drag. And it's and the meaning of that drag is ambiguous. It could be radical. It could be conservative. It could be a questioning of patriarchy. It could be completely misogynistic. It's but these questions, when we're looking at these dramas, have to remain open, and then we look at a character like Clytemnestra or Cassandra or Hecuba or Medea, and we gape at them and think, what is going on here? Everything seems to be in question and at stake, and it's to that extent. The plays are incredibly contemporary. Another kind of argument I'm trying to make in the book is that, again, maybe it's too neat a historical point, but that we've ended up in a situation where we find ourselves, the contemporaries of the tragic Greeks in a strange way.
That's the us, yeah. One missing tragedy you wish we had?
Oh, one missing. Oh,
you mentioned one by Timocles, I think. But is there one that's referenced?
Women sacrificing at the Dionysia or something like that. Something like that. Yeah.
Is there one you think, oh my God, I wish this had survived?
I wish we had one of the another satyr play or two. I wish we had the full version of the Trackers of Oxyrhynchus by Sophocles, and there were and also that we've got, because basically we've got
one trilogy, one surviving full trilogy.
One surviving trilogy, although some people say that there might have been just the Oresteia was unique. It wasn't a common habit to have three interlocking plays. So that we have basically the kind of greatest hits from the 5th century BC, 7 plays by Sophocles, 7 plays by Aeschylus, and then some plays by Euripides. And then because of a library classification glitch, we wound up with some plays that begin with certain Greek letters, iota and kappa, and that gives us a bunch more Euripides plays. Mm-hmm. So it's a strange corpus. But there would have been hundreds in the 5th century, so it'd be nice to have them all back, but it'd be time-consuming, wouldn't it?
Yeah. It's a Stoppard line from Arcadia about the themes will repeat even if they're lost in time. But
yeah, right. I mean, what's interesting about the tragedies is that there was the same themes. You can see, we know the titles of the plays, we know when they were performed, we know their authors, we know who won the prizes. We know that, and it's remarkable how few themes are, and how few
A few myths, or
a few stories. You know, like the story of Oedipus is dealt with over and over again. The Trojan War is dealt with over and over again. And so, what is one of the things that's most interesting about that is the fact that there's no suspense here. Everybody would have known these stories. These were the stories. Everybody knew who Oedipus was and what happened to him. So therefore, the drama consisted in how you were going to innovate in relationship to a story that had no kind of obvious suspense. There were no sort of spoiler alerts here, right?
Well, it could be like Tarantino killing Hitler at the end of Inglourious Basterds, which I didn't see that coming, but okay, you take it in whatever direction you want. But Can you talk a little? It's something that comes up right at the end, really. The difference between experiencing the plays and the tragedies and reading them.
Yeah,
that sense of being in the audience.
Yeah,
and I know it's something you know. It's very much about reading the text that's there for the most part, but you do have to step back and accept that these were still performances.
Yeah,
and what that meant for you.
Well, I mean.
Or how that experience one colors the other.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, a couple of things would be. I mean, this is a book about tragedy that's largely based on me reading plays, and then imagining it, visualizing it. In a sense, that's all I need. I can see what's going on just by reading the plays, and for some reason. I guess this goes back a long, long way. I mean, I did a class at something called the Workers' Educational Association, the WEA, which existed in England. I was about 18, 19, and I drifted out of education and was slowly on a path that would lead me back. And I did a little class with a graduate student from Cambridge on drama and read 19th, 20th century drama. And anyway, so there's something about, for me, reading plays, which is enough. The fact that the words don't fill the whole page, that there's space left to imagine and see. Yeah. And there isn't a narrator who's kind of poking his or her nose in and telling me what to look at and what to think. So that is... that's powerful. What was the question there?
Well, the difference between experiencing it as an audience versus as a reader, knowing that you're in a community.
So in the book, the plays were largely read. On the other hand,
you do have to step back.
On the other hand, I mean, again, going back to, I came from a family that did not go to the theatre or anything.
Or closely own a book, I think you would say. Or own a book.
Or own a book. No books, nothing. And so when I first went to theatre, really it hit me when I was about 22. And I had a friend called Sally. And Sally had gone to the theatre. And she took me to, or we went to theatre at the university, provincial theatre in Colchester, not that good, I'm sure, but for me it was a revelation, sitting in a theatre and watching this drama unfold, watching that and that feeling of, oh God, this is actual human beings acting something in front of me. And I remember being in a studio theatre in Colchester, and there was a performance of Othello. I think it's the only time I've seen Othello actually live, and I was, about 2 feet from where Othello was murdering Desdemona, and I could feel the kind of heat from their bodies, and thinking, God, this is amazing. And I have this naive faith in the experience of theatre. Yeah, so that there's something. I go to theatre as much as I can. One of the reasons I like being in New York is for that reason, and that means most of the time you see things that are rubbish. But still, when the house lights dim and you're waiting for the thing to start. I'm full of hope that this could be it. This could transform everything, and I'm never so entertained as I am when I'm, in a theatre watching a play that is half good, and even better if it's good. I find that there's almost a kind of not quite out of body experience, but I'm watching this as a spectator. A lot of the book is about what it's like to be a spectator and spectatorial distance and what's involved with that. But that experience that you can have when you give yourself over completely to what's happening on the stage, and try and follow its movement, its logic, and then see where that takes you. So, I mean, yeah.
But again, it's neither appetitive nor cathartic in the
no,
critiquing Plato and Aristotle sense.
It's neither of those things. It's something more. The anecdote that I end up with, the end of the book that I borrow from Anne Carson, or conversation I had with Anne Carson years ago, where she talks about we're talking about a production of her translation of Antigone that was at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, and with the book is really indebted to Anne Carson's approach, because she tries to, in a translation, she tries to drain the pathos from the plays, and there's a kind of coldness about what she does, and so her translation of the Antigone is very cold. It's lacking in sentimentality, and it's all the more powerful for that reason. But inevitably, actors, when they get hold of that, try to re-inject pathos into it so they can do their party piece and steal the show and all of that. So that's a problem, because there's something cold and distant about Anne Carson's translations, and that coldness is able to, in a way that appears contradictory, but it isn't, by kind of denying that obvious sentimentality, the obvious pathos, she opens us to a kind of molten core, a kind of fire, which is what's really burning there. And she talks in this conversation about, we're talking about catharsis, and I say something like, well, catharsis doesn't really capture it, and she says, I've never really understood catharsis, and she then goes on to say it's more like walking down the street, and she begins to give what sounds like a personal anecdote, although if you think about it, it's hard to know how that would have happened, walking down the street in Detroit and walking past a steel factory, and there's molten steel in there, and you can look into the core of things, and you see that for a second, and then you carry on walking down the street. And theatre is very much that for me, that you can move through it, and you can glimpse this burning core of stuff, of life, and then you continue on your way. You're not cleansed by that. There's no catharsis, there's no transformation. There's more of a kind of almost like Coen Brothers kind of austerity to it.
Yeah.
And that's I guess that's what I like.
Does transformation exist? Not necessarily through art or philosophy. Are we who we are?
In general,
yeah. Do we transform? Or do we just get worse?
Well, there are different. I mean, there are kind of there are clever ways of answering that, which would be I remember there was David Lynch's Inland Empire. One of the characters that Laura Dern plays when she's playing. She's playing a kind of a one-eyed hooker at this point. She plays these 4 or 5 different roles in this play, in this film. And she's saying, you know, people don't change, they reveal. And then you realize, you know, what kind of unspeakable monstrosities they are. So the transformations come in negative. You see people what they are. That would be a clever way of answering it. I do think that there can be transformation. It's something I'm interested in, fascinated by, actually. I mean, another corner of my mind is I just got back from a trip. Well, I've been away for quite a while, but at the end of that trip, I was in. I went to England for a few days to look at some. I have a obsession with medieval Gothic cathedrals, which is something that's gone back to. I've been attached to for decades. Anyway, I went to look at a number of cathedrals and then found my way to Norwich, which is somewhere I've been to many times, but I wanted to look at some churches, and I wanted to visit the church of St. Julian, where Julian of Norwich was an anchoress in the late 14th century. And the reason I was interested in that is because that Julian, which isn't her name, it's the name of the church, we don't know what her name was, undergoes this series of showings, revelations at the point of near death, when she's 30 and a half years old. She's dying and her mother is there, a priest is brought in, and a crucifix is held up, and then that crucifix begins to bleed, and she begins to receive, for a period of 20 hours, a series of visions that she then spends the next 40 years trying to figure out theologically. And yes, I'm very interested in conversion experiences. I just came back last week. I was in New England, and I went with my friends Elizabeth and Ross to the Shaker village in Hancock, which I've been to before, and I'm reading again about the Shakers, and I'm fascinated with those experiences of conversion and with religious experience in general, really, but with the idea that you can move from a kind of aversion of the self, an aversion of the self to itself, which you can find, most dramatically, say, in the character of someone like Hamlet, who knows too much about himself and is consumed with self-loathing. That aversion to a kind of conversio where you can turn around to something else, point towards something else, and to that extent change is possible. Yeah. So I do, in the plays, I'm not sure, but in other aspects of my life, yeah, I do believe in transformation.
Can you cheer for an athlete you know is an absolutely horrible human being? You've written about soccer. We'll say football because I want you to feel more comfortable.
Right. Yeah.
If you know, my experience, I was a New Jersey Nets fan, and they 20 years ago almost, traded for Jason Kidd, turns the team into a winner. They go to back-to-back finals. Incredible ride, but the only reason they were able to get him in a trade is because he had punched his way through the bathroom door and beat the hell out of his wife when he was in Phoenix. Difficult to cheer sometimes when you think, wow, we're doing really great. That guy did something really, really terrible. Does that become do you have any moral hang-ups over?
Sure. Oh, sure, yeah. I mean, you can love a bad guy in sport. You can love a hard man. Someone like Roy Keane, who's an Irish soccer player, played for Manchester United, brilliant player, but took no prisoners, broke legs, screamed at people. But there was a kind of
we're talking off field, also, though. That's the
but he wasn't violent like the. But yeah, it does matter. It does matter. I mean, I
cringe but cheer. Or
no, I mean, it would matter to me if I found out that players from my football team, Liverpool, were involved in some unpleasant shenanigans. That would affect what I thought of them.
Yeah.
So I implicitly want to believe that they're benevolent, good beings, which of course they all are.
Yes, naturally. Otherwise, you wouldn't have gotten to Liverpool.
Right.
Tell me about New York. Specifically, what New York was before you got here. Did you have some image of it?
Okay.
Was there a New York of the mind for you?
That's an interesting question. There was an America of the mind. I started to come to the States in 1991. It was the first time I came. I was 31 years old. And people that I'd been taught by, firstly, when I was a student, I was taught by a lot of Americans in England who wound up there. Either they went to study there or they went there to escape the Vietnam. So they were usually, kind of
a certain
weird
stripe. Yeah.
Yeah, leftist characters, fascinating. And so I had an idea of America, and then I started to come here, and then I got interested in I'd never really studied American philosophy or literature seriously. And I then, discovered the work of Stanley Cavell in the 1990s and did a lot of work on Cavell. And Cavell, one of Cavell's books is called This New Yet Unapproachable America. Line from, I think it's from Emerson. And I then began to read Emerson and Thoreau and Whitman and Melville, and then I had America became kind of a theme, a kind of philosophical theme for me.
But a 19th century one.
Largely 19th century, and then it's in all of its complexity and beauty and terror and violence, but not so much New York. I had an idea of I didn't really have a dream of New York.
Was there a place you dreamed about traveling, or was it just getting to London from?
It was more getting that. I thought, how would I put it? It's that it's odd, and it's also odd in retrospect to put it all together. That my family's from Liverpool, and people from Liverpool will say, we're Scouse, we're Liverpool, we're not English. Right? England begins somewhere else. And so who are we? We're from Liverpool. Our ancestry is probably Irish or some kind of mixture. And Liverpool Football Club is identified very much as European, right? Rather than English. So there's that idea. And also that what came in through Liverpool, through the merchant navy, through the sailors, was the music of the American South, right? Therefore, the Beatles. That's how that begins. Yeah. Liverpool was a port that sucked in,
brought in all these influences.
Yeah. Brought in that. That's why the Beatles happened in Liverpool. Why that stuff happened in Liverpool in the 50s and 60s, and so that idea of America as a kind of fantasy land. That was there, and then growing up with my mother loved musicals like South Pacific and Oklahoma and things like that. So that was very much. And my dad, although he was, firmly racist, loved Motown, and I grew up listening to a lot of Motown, which was weird considering the views that he had.
Oh, mine was the same way. Incredibly racist, but loved disco music from the 70s.
Right,
so,
there you go.
It's.
But in New York, it's more. It was I got to the point where I had this sort of weird beginning. I went very fast for a number of years, then wound up in an academic job, for which I was very grateful. I still am really grateful to get paid to think. It's great. And then, relatively quickly went through all the kind of permutations I could go through Essex, the place where I'd been a student. I felt I suppose the pressure of the class system as the years went by, more and more, and felt intellectually that I'd got everything I could get out of the place I was from, and I wanted something else. So when the chance to come to New York happened, I seized hold of it, and it forced me to kind of raise my game, because I was teaching in a department of the new school full of these, Leviathan intellects who, and where the measure of the currency of exchange is teaching, and how good and effective you were as a teacher. Mm-hmm. And I was teaching with people like Richard Bernstein and Agnes Heller and Yeri Yavel and Derrida and Charles Taylor and Chris Daver had all taught there recently. And so you really had to, in order to swim in this pond, you really had to get up to speed. So that really helped. So there's a kind of there was an intellectual attraction to New York, and then the idea of it as a place where, if you're you can be lucky if you're lucky, yeah. Right? It's faded a bit in recent years, but I'm still attached to the place. Yeah.
And well, unlike being back in England, opening your mouth and having any sort of accent here means you're somehow an intellectual.
Right.
Coming from Liverpool, the moment you open your mouth, I'm sure there's a degree of, as you said, that class curtain just comes down.
The class curtain comes down.
Yeah.
And that's not going. For a period of time, it appeared that the class barriers were porous, had broken down. There was a kind of something happened in England from the Second World War onwards, reforms in education, development of the new universities in the 50s and 60s, and there was genuine social mobility. The old class system appeared to have fallen apart, and yet here we are 30, 40 years later, and
turns out to be pretty robust.
The Prime Minister's an old Etonian, who got the job over against two other old Etonians, and you just think, nothing's changed.
Power has a way of reinforcing itself.
Yeah. So I enjoy England much more at a distance.
Yeah.
There's a kind of nostalgic, completely delusional patriotism that I have, which is the minute I go back, it dissolves, but when I'm not there, I can...
Yeah, you would have to justify it if you were back there.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess the idea of... what attracts me and which perplexes me about this place is the depth of inhabitation. The fact that, even in New York, you go back a few centuries and then it's just, you've got, some Lenape... Native Americans.
I live in a former Lenape hunting ground. My town is founded 1742. So,
right.
To us in America, that's old.
Right. Yeah. And so, and so the idea of being somewhere where there's been inhabitation by people who are not entirely dissimilar from you, going back some millennia, there is a sense of the sedimentation of that interests me, and the United States is a very different place.
Yeah.
Right? It's defined, and that gives it a kind of exhilarating wildness. That you can go up to New England and look at what happened there, the 18th, 19th century, and how people just broke out and did, terrible, violent things, but also these outbursts of extraordinary religious enthusiasm and invention, and that becomes possible in this different landscape. And so there is something obviously liberating about that. But I do feel a wistful nostalgia at a distance without wanting to do anything with it.
I was going to ask, you don't go back too often, right?
No.
Good. Where did philosophy begin for you? We know that wonder is supposed to be the beginning of philosophy, but I think you've said disappointment is actually...
Yeah, I'm the disappointment guy. It doesn't end in disappointment, but it begins in disappointment. That's my...
contention.
Yeah, it begins in the idea of that the world is... everything is not wonderful, and all things are not shining, to quote Terence Malick. The world is an unjust, violent, disorderly place where questions of meaning and questions of justice are open questions. So that's what I mean. We begin from an idea of the collapse of meaning, the death of God on the one hand, and we begin from an idea of the experience of injustice, of blood running in the streets, in the merriest way, as if it were champagne, as Dostoevsky would say. And so we begin from this idea of deficiency and lack and disappointment, and then it becomes a question of how one can form something, invent something in relation to that. So philosophy, in my view, begins in an experience of disappointment, and then it becomes a question of what you then construct. It doesn't end in disappointment. But personally, it began in an experience of... as for many people, you get these inchoate, sensations, moods when you're young, and in particular, in my case, in many people's case, the experience of anxiety and alienation and disorientation. And I looked to books as a way of exploring that. And then when I got to university to study literature, I found myself in a philosophy class and thought,
this is what I want.
What's going on here? This is interesting. These people seem clever. Mm-hmm. I couldn't figure out how they could think the way they thought. It perplexed me. Whereas the literature people that taught me, they were good, but I thought to myself, I could do that.
You could reverse engineer how they got where they got.
I could do that, more or less. Not as well as they, but I could imagine doing that. Whereas the philosophy teachers I had were, pretty awe-inspiring. So then, and also the other thing was, I could read less. That philosophy became, the texts are shorter. You can concentrate more acutely on them. And if I'd have done literature back then, I would have had to read, 2 600-page novels a week, and
I'd still take that over some Kant or Hegel, frankly. But that's.
I like reading difficult books. Yeah, no, I like reading difficult texts. I think there's a kind of there's a pleasure in difficulty. There's it's intriguing. So I ended up spending a lot of time reading very obscure books, and then and what I was able to do for whatever reason, because I think I'm I don't think I'm particularly gifted in any way. I think I could speak about those things clearly. Mm-hmm. And so I was cursed with the gift of clarity.
A friend of mine many years ago, in fact, back at St. John's when I was in grad school, described being a genius as being someone who can explain difficult things to normal people and make it clear. Not to say that you're a genius or anything,
I wouldn't say
but just the ability to convey things. And that was my writing job. I spent 20 years as an editor of business magazines. And what's your qualification? I can explain difficult concepts to normal people.
Yeah.
That's really what it comes to.
Yeah, which I did through making notes. I think if there's some message I'd like to send to the world through this podcast, it would be the importance of note-taking, mm-hmm. which is the most... And what that meant for me is I did... This really hit home as an undergraduate, but then in my first year as a graduate student when I was working in French, mm-hmm. and that was disorienting. I was working and writing in a second language. And so I was reading things, and then I would make précis, make summaries of them. And then once I had the summary of an article or something, I had the thing, I had it down. And just that, so what I see with a lot of students to this day is they'll read voraciously, and that's a wonderful thing, but they won't follow it through into note taking and summarizing, and that's the core of clarity.
I notice in the review copy you have of your book, you've got plenty of notes written in.
Yeah.
With your actual books, not your own titles, do you actually write in the margins?
A lot, yeah.
Okay, because my great terror is that someday somebody will open mine and realize how absolutely banal all my observations are. So all I do is dog ear and then try to figure out later, why did I mark that page? I don't no idea what I was looking for or what I saw in that one the first time around. So
that's also
more confidence in me. So,
it's also imitation, right? So that doing philosophy or doing anything, really, but doing philosophy, a lot of it is about emulation. And so I had my teacher in France was a man called Dominique Janicot, and he was very kind to me for no particular reason. And he used to, I noticed with his books, we'd talk about a book every couple of weeks, and he made notes in a slanty writing on the inside of the cover. He would underline things, but he had this sort of sloping writing. And I imitated that. Mm-hmm. So a lot of my books have got that kind of, like this slanty, slopey writing. That's a kind of emulation of what Dominique showed me. And also, I remember a student of Stanley Cavell saying that, once he was in his office in Harvard and Cavell had gone to the bathroom or something, and his copy of the Philosophical Investigations was on his desk, and so he picked it up and looked at it. And so I said, what did it look like? He said, there were lots of words circled. He circled a lot of words, and so I still circle things. I circle things because I think that this is so. It's a kind of reading as a way of possessing something. It's not entirely wholesome, but if I don't mark up text, then I'm. So we were talking before about the Peregrine by J.A. Baker, and I'm most distressed because my copy of that book, which is heavily, heavily marked up, I took it to New England last week, and it's
didn't make it back.
Didn't make it back, and it can't be located in the house, and I'm trying. I'm going to go back and see if I can find it, but. I couldn't work with a new copy. I need that copy. That's the copy I've spent weeks on that, And so I use underlinings and notations and circlings and different color pens as ways of making that text mine, and I can mobilize it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in my case, a lot of it is books that I'm reading for the podcast. So I'll usually have my iPad nearby. I'll open up, write down either questions or, like page 84, this comment. But yeah, I've just got that strange thing about marking it up, partly for the disfiguring the book, but also the, again, fear that someone will open it and say, Gil, you're a moron. Why would you think this? But again, that's,
Two things there. Firstly, the people that don't touch books seem to be morally superior. I had a colleague called Stephen Mulhall, Essex, who is now at Oxford, and he read a lot, but he never marked the books. He never bent the spine. Yeah, and the books, when he finished reading them, looked untouched. Yeah. And I thought, this must be a superior being. And the counterexample, another teacher of mine called Roger used to only mark up texts with a pencil, apart from the Bible. And the Bible he would underline in pen heavily, and I've done that. So you see, these habits of note-taking, summarising are things that one emulates. It's a thing that's maybe not often talked about.
Well, I embarrassed a guest last week when we were in his library, and I saw he had all 4 volumes of Anthony Pohl's Dance to the Music of Time, which looked as though they hadn't been opened. But apparently he was like your first example. He reads the book but doesn't break the spine. And I said, I guess you'll get to that. I read it last year. I'm like, I'm sorry. It just looks completely unread. And that's the sort of thing when it's on somebody's shelf, you think... It's
impressive.
Yeah, did they take the time? Did they not take the time?
My books are heavily marked up.
And the big question, it's been almost 4 years since David Bowie died.
Okay.
How's your philosophy of Bowie changed over time, your appreciation of him, perhaps. And the Bowie thing I was going to mention, or the Harold Bloom thing, was it was my birthday in 2016. I woke up, got the news that Bowie had died. The weekend before, and then the Harold Bloom podcast was not exactly confirmed until later that morning when he's like, "Oh yeah, sure, come up to New Haven now and we'll record." So basically, I had Bowie's death hanging over my head, jump in the car and go, sit down with Harold Bloom for an hour to have a conversation. Very just on my birthday, very surreal day all around.
I bet,
so that was kind of heavy for me. But how has your Bowie changed in the years since he's been gone?
Well, his there's nothing like retrospective vindication, is there? I remember when I started to write on Bowie. I've often had this over the years. People think you're crazy, Why would you write? You're meant to be a proper philosopher. Why are you wasting your time writing on someone like David Bowie? What a stupid thing to do. And then that was finished. It came out, and then when he died, it was very sad. And I did a radio show.
Yeah, there's a New York Times podcast that you did.
Yeah, there was that. But actually, but what, weirder than that, there was the day, because it was when Black Star came out. Black Star came out. I'd seen the. Let me get the order of things right here.
I think he died the night of the 10th or maybe the 9th.
Yeah.
Black Star had come out a day or two before.
Yeah. So my mother died on December the 7th, 2015.
Oh, jeez. Okay.
So she died a month and a bit before Bowie. And I was very close to my mother. It was a long story, to say the least, as it usually is. But I was with her when she died. I went into a kind of shutdown. I went into a kind of inert insomniac state for weeks. It was really strange. Time wouldn't flow, it wouldn't move. Often happens with grief, that you feel that time is just kind of stuck and it won't flow, and the days just were endless, and there were lots of funeral preparations to be involved with and all of that. And it was, anyway, so eventually we buried her. It was about December the 16th. And then I came back to New York the next day, and the night I got back, I saw a preview of the Lazarus show.
Bowie's musical.
The musical, yeah. I've been invited to do a talk back with Henry, I forget his second name, his musical director. Was it Henry Holt, something like that? That's the publisher, isn't it?
I'll look it up.
Yeah, his musical director, lovely man. And December the 17th, and then it was Christmas, and I was still deep in grief and kind of just frozen in the sense in which I couldn't do anything. I couldn't move or think, or it was a really strange period of time. And then I got the news from my ex. It must have been 6 o'clock in the morning, or very early on that Monday morning, when he the news of his death came through. And then that was a strange one. I'd been listening to Black Star. I did a radio show with something on ESPN or Sirius XM, I forget what it was, on Black Star, and we were talking about it, laughing, joking, and then he was dead. And then I kept on listening to Black Star, and it felt different. There was a palpable, perceptible shift in how that album. I listened to what I heard in that album from before his death to after his death, which was peculiar. It was as if he was kind of speaking from beyond the grave. Then I wrote that little piece for the New York Times on Bowie, and then I spent the next, after he died, about a week or so, I was 10 days, I was talking to, doing interviews and doing odd, and I just met a lot of people for whom Bowie was very important. And it was horrible that he died, but it was great in the sense in which that I was able to speak and think again. It began to shift the dimensions of grief for me, grief for my mother's death. Something about Bowie's death that kind of enabled something to be voiced. And then I also...
Is it the community aspect? The fact that there was a group, a worldwide group?
Yeah, but it was more that the Bowie's fans are always individuals. I mean, Bowie... You always felt that Bowie was talking to you,
sure,
and you alone. It wasn't a communal experience. It wasn't a kind of Dionysian loss of boundaries between people. It was as if he knew who you were, and he'd sought you out. He was addressing you. So the Bowie fans that I met were individuals, and what I took from that, which was really really buoyed me up, was the realization that Bowie would survive. That there's my Bowie, which is the Bowie that I saw on Top of the Pops in 1972, that I loved through the 1970s and even the 80s and onwards. But my Bowie fixed in somebody that was born in 1960. And who, arguably can have some authentic claim to being a Bowie fan, to realizing that Bowie would continue.
Everybody has their own.
Everybody has their own Bowie.
And it's all valid. It's
and around the corner here, I was spent this evening with this young woman. It was some interview for some magazine. She must have been in her 30 or something. And she had her Bowie, and we talked for 2 hours, and her Bowie was a queer Bowie and a malleable Bowie, and it was a very different Bowie to my Bowie, but it was her Bowie. And you realise that it will carry on. Bowie will be listened to into the future. And there was something incredibly uplifting about that, because, for someone like me, for whom pop culture is really important, and music is really the fundamental medium, pop music, you sort of think this is all going to die. This isn't going to last. And that's not true. It's like Bowie's death in many ways. In Bowie's death, I think, underlines the fact that this will survive and develop and be listened to and be revered in future generations. And that gives me heart. So I'm very sad David Bowie left us. But what a death. I mean, I can't think of a more noble and private death than Bowie's death. And there's no indignity in it. It wasn't like, poor Prince with fentanyl collapsing in his elevator, or Michael Jackson. It was, Bowie disappeared. And we know nothing about the circumstances. We know that he died of cancer, but we don't know. He was able to keep his privacy, and he died after having sent a message in Black Star, which was the message that he wanted his fans to hear. And that was so I think it's the most beautiful death I can think of, Bowie's death.
And I'm sure we'll find a tie-in to Tragedy of the Greeks and Us, but
yeah, I mean,
I bet there's a thematic connection we can draw.
Yeah, the inauthenticity of Euripides, the inauthenticity of Bowie, the spectacle, drama. Also, the way in which Bowie is, can communicate through these, intense slices of affect, but what he addresses you, as an isolated, disaffected individual. He can kind of pick you out. And I think that there's something about, the connection to another kind of old obsession of mine has been, which doesn't connect with anything we've talked about at all, is R.D. Laing, existential psychoanalysis. And his book, The Divided Self, and the sense of the self as being alienated, what does he say, petrified, turned to stone, distant, where everything is kind of experienced at a distance, as if it's projections on a screen that you're observing or hiding behind. I mean, that, if you've had that experience of life, as many people have, then Bowie gives voice to that in the most powerful way and connects those people together without producing catharsis or complete transformation. We're still the same bits of wreckage we were before, but we're bits of wreckage plus the music of Bowie.
Sounds good. I will let you get to your evening. Mm-hmm. Thanks so much, Simon.
Pleasure.
And that was Simon Critchley. I loved the new book, Tragedy, the Greeks and Us, published by Pantheon. It's in hardcover now with paperback coming out early in 2020. Honestly, it's a book that I think I'll return to in the years ahead, especially as I start rereading the tragedies. In fact, I actually recently picked up Anne Carson's translations of Euripides from New York Review Books when I was walking into a bookstore in Philadelphia and wanted to make sure I supported them in some way. That one goes under the title Grief Lessons, and that, for me, came out of Simon's recommendation of her translations. I'm a Lattimore guy. I've got all the University of Chicago translations of the Greek tragedies in a slipcover edition here in my library, but I figure I'll branch out. You should visit Simon's website, simoncritchley.org, to learn more about his other books, writing, the columns, interviews, and every damn thing else. And that's SIMONCRITCHLEY.org. As I hope you got out of our conversation, he is not some dry philosophy professor, but someone who engages with the world and tries to understand the fun stuff too. Like I mentioned at the top, the About page on simoncritchley.org is a massive interview of him. It comes from the book How to Stop Living and Start Worrying, which sounds like it's right up my alley. Now, after we wrapped, I asked Simon, so, who you been reading? And if you want to hear his answer to that and get some extra conversation, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories show so you can get access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. The second quarter 2019 episode features an hour of book recommendations and fun conversation with Mark Allen Stamety, David Shields, Michael Carroll, Frederick Tutton, Ursi Soteropoulos, Caitlin Foisey, Seth, Nina Bunjevac, Stephen Guarnacha, Hugh Ryan, Bill Griffith, Boris Fishman, and Barbara Nessim. You can support the Virtual Memories show via patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. I've got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including that podcast, the patron-only blog that I've just started posting to a little bit more, handwritten show notes for every episode now that I've got a new scanner that I can go and zap all of the show notes from the last 100 or so episodes that have been piling up in a little cubby next to my desk, my secret project, which I hope to get back to, and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. Now, I recorded this one at Simon's apartment in Brooklyn. I had to drive all the way in because of various traffic-related reasons, so 2 tolls adding up to about $20. I found street parking. On the flip side, I got there kind of early, so coffee, early dinner, etc. So if you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, coffee, or just toss me some money because you think the show is worth it, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. A special thanks go out to Nick Bartosik, Buzz Carter, Michael Hacker, Michael Janizik, Fred Kish, Annie Koyama, Jonathan Kranz, Kevin Katila, Jack Les Camella, Stephen Nadler, Barbara Nessim, Jim Ottaviani, Payne Prophet, Dmitry Samarov, Stephen Solomon, Greg Tanner, Ford Thomas, and Armando Veve for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories show. We have the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.